For 15 years, my job was to be the firm's janitor, not the kind that mops floors, but the kind that mops up felonies. My official title was Head of Compliance for Sterling Thorne Investments, a name that sounded as solid and dependable as the granite lobby of our Midtown headquarters. But my real role, the one that wasn't on my business card, was Chief Cleanup Officer for our CEO, Richard Thorne. Richard was a force of nature, a man who could sell ice in a blizzard and convince you it was the best deal you'd ever get. His recklessness was matched only by his charm, a truly terrifying combination in the world of high finance. I was the silent partner to that recklessness. I neutralized lawsuits with quiet settlements, placated regulators with carefully worded reports, and buried scandals so deep they'd never see the light of day. I did it all to protect the firm, to protect the hundreds of jobs that depended on its stability. The board, the partners, even Richard himself, they mistook my silence for loyalty. They saw me as the company man, the old guard, the steady hand who would always put the firm first. And for 15 years they were right. Then came last week. Last week, I learned that loyalty, when it only flows one way, isn't loyalty at all. It's servitude. The blunder was a project Richard had personally championed, something he'd called Project Omega. It was a high-risk, high-reward venture into emerging market derivatives, a space we had no business being in. Every analyst, every risk manager, and I myself had advised against it. We wrote memos, we built models showing the catastrophic potential downside. Richard had smiled his million-dollar smile in the boardroom, patted us on the back, and said, "Gentlemen, fortune favors the bold. We need to be lions, not sheep." As it turns out, lions sometimes get eaten by crocodiles, which is exactly what happened. The market shifted overnight, and Project Omega didn't just fail, it imploded, vaporizing nearly a quarter of our liquid capital, and more importantly, triggering automated flags with every regulatory body from the SEC to the Financial Conduct Authority in London. The call came on a Tuesday morning. It was from Richard's assistant, a perpetually terrified young woman named Chloe. "Richard needs to see you and Lucas in the main conference room, immediately." My stomach tightened. Lucas Vance was my protégé. He was a brilliant kid, barely 28, with a mind for compliance that was sharper than mine had ever been. He saw the world in systems, in rules and ethics, and he believed, with an earnestness I'd long since lost, that those things mattered. I'd hired him out of law school 3 years prior, seeing in him a younger, more idealistic version of myself. He was the lead analyst who had written the most damning, most prescient report on the dangers of Project Omega. His projections of the potential losses were so accurate it was almost eerie. We walked into the conference room. Richard was already there, standing by the vast window overlooking the city, his back to us. He looked like a king surveying his domain. He turned, and the mask was already on. His face was a perfect portrait of grave, reluctant duty. "Arthur, Lucas, sit down," he said, his voice heavy with counterfeit sorrow. We sat. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. My heart began to pound a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I knew this ritual. This was the prelude to a sacrifice. "There's no easy way to say this," Richard began, finally looking at Lucas. "The preliminary review of the Omega failure is complete. It's clear there was a significant breakdown in our compliance pre-screening process, a catastrophic one." I felt a cold dread wash over me. I started to speak, to say that the process hadn't failed at all, that the process had been ignored, but Richard held up a hand, his eyes still locked on Lucas. "Lucas, your analysis was insufficient. You failed to adequately stress test the models for this specific kind of market volatility. You gave it a green light when you should have put up a red flag the size of this building." It was the most audacious, most breathtaking lie I had ever heard, even from him. Lucas just stared, his face pale, his mouth slightly agape. He was in shock. He looked at me, his eyes wide with confusion and a dawning sense of betrayal. He had a file with him, the one containing his report. I could see his hand trembling as he clutched it. "Sir, that's not true," Lucas stammered. "My report, the one I sent to you and the entire board, it explicitly detailed this exact scenario. It's on page 47. I recommended an immediate halt." Richard sighed, a long mournful sound. He shook his head slowly, like a father disappointed in a son. "I know this is hard to hear, son. I know you thought you did good work, but the buck has to stop somewhere. The firm has taken a major hit. The board needs to see that we are taking decisive action, that we hold our people accountable." He slid a folder across the polished mahogany table. It was from HR. "This is a generous severance package. We'll classify it as a voluntary resignation to protect your reputation. You'll sign a standard non-disclosure agreement. It's for the best, Lucas. It's time to move on." My blood ran cold. I watched Lucas's face crumble. The fight went out of him, replaced by a hollow, vacant look. In that moment, he wasn't a brilliant analyst. He was just a kid whose career had been executed to cover for the king's mistake. 15 years of my life, 15 years of swallowing my own integrity to clean up after this man. I had justified it all with the idea that I was protecting the institution, protecting people like Lucas. And here he was, being fed to the wolves, not for a mistake he made, but for the sin of being right when the CEO was wrong. My silence, the asset Richard had counted on for a decade and a half, was gone. It had curdled into something cold and hard in the pit of my stomach. I looked at Richard. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at Lucas with that theatrical pity, playing his role to perfection. And I realized my loyalty had been a leash, and he had just used it to strangle the career of a young man I had sworn to mentor. I didn't say a word. I just sat there, my hands flat on the table, feeling the cold wood beneath my palms. They saw my silence as acquiescence. They mistook the calm before the storm for a clear sky. That was their first mistake. This morning, I didn't leak a story to a journalist. That's messy. That's Richard's style. I did something far more precise. I scheduled a meeting with the private equity group that had finalized their acquisition of our firm just 2 weeks ago. The deal was done, the ink was dry, but they didn't truly know what they had bought. I was about to walk into that meeting, into their sleek, sterile boardroom, and present them with my private files. For 15 years I had kept a ledger, a meticulous, cross-referenced, and deeply damning record of every near disaster, every quiet settlement, every regulatory dodge, and every lie. It showed the true, terrifying cost of Richard Thorne's leadership. By the time I was done, they would understand that their new company's biggest liability wasn't in the market, it was in the corner office. The drive home after Lucas was escorted out of the building was the longest of my life. I drove in complete silence, the radio off, the city's noise, a distant, muffled roar. The knot in my stomach had hardened into a block of ice. It wasn't just anger I felt, it was a profound, hollowing sense of shame. For 15 years I had been the enabler. I was the high-priced mechanic who kept the engine running, knowing the driver was drunk. I'd told myself it was for the greater good, for the paychecks of the administrative assistants and the pensions of the back-office staff. But sitting in that traffic, watching the anonymous faces in the cars around me, I knew that was just another lie. I'd told myself. Richard pulled the trigger, but I had loaded the gun for him every single time. When I got home, I didn't go inside. My wife, Eleanor, would be there, and her perceptive eyes would see the cracks in my carefully constructed facade instantly. I couldn't face her, not yet. Instead, I walked around to the back of the house, to my garden. It was my sanctuary, the one place in my life, governed by logic and order. I had spent years on it. The neat rows of heirloom tomatoes, the carefully pruned rose bushes, the perfectly edged lawn. It was a world of cause and effect, where careful planning and hard work yielded predictable, beautiful results. It was everything my professional life was not. I sank onto a stone bench, the scent of damp earth and lavender filling the air, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt the terrifying sensation of being completely adrift. The entire ethical framework I'd built to justify my career had just been dynamited. Lucas's face kept flashing in my mind. The shock, the dawning horror, and then the emptiness. It was the look of a man who had not just lost a job but had lost faith, and I had been the high priest of that false religion. My promise to him, whispered over coffees and late-night case reviews, had been that at Sterling Thorne, competence and integrity were the ultimate currency. He had believed me. He had done his job with a rigor that should have been rewarded, and instead it had been the cause of his professional execution. The thematic trigger I'd so often espoused in our industry rang hollow in my ears. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. Richard hadn't just lost it, he'd thrown it away like garbage. My mind drifted back, sifting through the wreckage of the past. The betrayals, big and small, started to stack up like bodies. I remembered the first one, the original sin. It was about 12, maybe 13 years ago. I was still relatively new in the head of compliance role. Richard had gotten a tip from a friend on a golf course about a biotech company that was about to get FDA approval for a blockbuster drug. It was privileged information, textbook insider trading. He made a series of trades through an obscure shell corporation. When the news broke, the stock skyrocketed, and the firm made a fortune. But the SEC started sniffing around. They couldn't prove anything, but the pattern was suspicious. I found the evidence, a series of encrypted emails, a paper trail that, if found, would not only ruin Richard but would likely bring down the entire firm. I went to him, my hands shaking, the printouts feeling like a radioactive brick in my briefcase. I was ready to resign. Richard didn't panic. He was never more charming than when he was cornered. He sat me down in his vast office, poured me a single malt scotch that cost more than my first car, and he spun his web. He talked about legacy, about building something that would last for 100 years. He said this was a one-time mistake, a moment of youthful exuberance. He framed it not as a crime, but as a bold move that had secured the bonuses of every employee that year. Arthur, he'd said, his voice a conspiratorial whisper, we are partners in this. I'm the rainmaker, and you're the man who makes sure the roof doesn't leak. Together we can build an empire. I need you. He made it sound like we were soldiers in a trench together. He made my complicity sound like a heroic sacrifice. I was younger then, more ambitious. The idea of being a partner to this magnetic figure was intoxicating, so I did it. I showed him how to destroy the evidence so thoroughly that not even a forensic team could find it. I wrote the official response to the SEC, a masterpiece of obfuscation and legal misdirection. The investigation was quietly closed. That was the first time I sold a piece of my soul. I told myself it would be the last. Then came the Vanguard acquisition, about 5 years ago. It was a mid-sized competitor we'd been circling for years. Richard became obsessed with acquiring them, seeing it as a monument to his ego. Our entire team of analysts, led by our then CFO, a wise, cautious man named David Chen, advised against it. The debt load was too high, their balance sheet was a mess of toxic assets. David told Richard to his face, "This will bankrupt us." Richard, in front of the entire executive committee, laughed. He said David lacked vision, that he was too timid to play in the big leagues. He pushed the deal through the board using sheer force of personality. 2 months after the ink was dry, we discovered the truth. The toxicity was far worse than we'd feared. We were leveraged to the hilt, and a slight downturn in the market sent us into a death spiral. David Chen resigned in protest. I stayed. I worked for 6 straight months without a day off, living on stale coffee and adrenaline. I was in meetings with creditors at 3 a.m., renegotiating debt covenants, finding legal loopholes to stave off a margin call that would have liquidated the entire company. I single-handedly structured the deal that saved us, spinning off the toxic assets into a separate entity and securing a bridge loan from a syndicate of very nervous banks. It was the most complex and exhausting work of my life. When the dust settled, Richard held a press conference. He stood at a podium and spoke of his unwavering belief and strategic foresight that had allowed him to navigate the firm through temporary headwinds. He never mentioned my name. Not once. He took a multi-million-dollar bonus that year for saving the company. I got a pat on the back and a gift certificate to a steakhouse. That was the moment I should have left. But Eleanor had just had a health scare, the medical bills were piling up, and the golden handcuffs were firmly locked. I told myself I was staying for my family. Another convenient lie. These memories churned in me, a toxic cocktail of regret and fury, but it was the thought of Lucas that brought it all into sharp, painful focus. I had started mentoring him because I saw the spark of the man I had once wanted to be. He was meticulous, ethical, and he genuinely believed in the system. We'd have lunch every couple of weeks. He'd ask questions about legal precedent, about the nuances of regulatory frameworks. He wasn't just trying to climb the ladder. He was trying to understand how to be good at his job, truly good. I remember one conversation vividly. We were discussing a gray area in a new set of international banking regulations. Lucas was worried about a potential interpretation that could expose our clients to risk. He said, "It's our duty to protect them, even if it means less profit on the front end. That's the foundation of trust, right?" I had looked him in the eye and said, "That's exactly right, Lucas. That's the foundation of everything. Never forget that." What a hypocrite I was. I had nurtured his principles while actively helping Richard incinerate them on the altar of his own ego. The betrayal wasn't just that Richard had fired him, it was that he had made a mockery of the very values I had personally instilled in my protégé. He had used my own teachings against the student. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across my perfect garden. The order and peace it usually brought me felt like a taunt. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was Lucas. My thumb hovered over the ignore button. I didn't want to hear the pain in his voice. I didn't want to face the man I had failed. But I answered. His voice was hollow, devoid of its usual energy. "Arthur," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm at a bar downtown. I just had to call someone." He wasn't crying, which was somehow worse. It was the sound of pure defeat. I keep going over it in my head. The report, the meeting. Did I do something wrong? Did I miss something? "No, Lucas," I said, my own voice tight. "You did everything right. That's the problem." There was a long pause. I could hear the clinking of glasses and indistinct chatter in the background. "He lied," Lucas said, a statement of simple, devastating fact. "He just stood there and lied. And everyone, you just sat there." There was no accusation in his tone, just confusion. It was the question of a believer whose God had been revealed as a cheap fraud. "I don't understand everything you taught me about this place, about integrity being our bedrock. Was it all just talk? Was it all a lie?" That was it. That was the catalyst. The knife he didn't even know he was twisting. It wasn't about the money or the promotions or my own wounded pride anymore. It was about that question. Was it all a lie? If I did nothing, the answer was yes. My entire career, my entire sense of self would be a lie. A quiet rage, cold and clear as a winter morning, settled over me. The shame and regret burned away, leaving behind a diamond-hard resolve. This wasn't about revenge anymore. Revenge was emotional and messy. This was about restoring balance to the universe. It was about proving that my life's work and the principles I had preached to that young man were not, in fact, a lie. "No, Lucas," I said, my voice now steady, imbued with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. "It wasn't a lie. I'm going to prove it to you." I hung up the phone before he could reply. I stood up from the bench and walked back into my house, the long shadows of the evening stretching behind me. Eleanor was in the kitchen. She looked up, her brow furrowed with concern. She took one look at my face and knew. "What did he do this time, Arthur?" she asked softly. I walked to my study, a room she called my fortress of solitude. The right thing, I said, a phrase that felt foreign and powerful on my tongue. For the first time in a very long time, I am going to do the right thing. And in that moment, I knew exactly what that meant. It meant opening the vault. My secret plan wasn't born of a sudden vengeful impulse. It was the product of 15 years of meticulous paranoid foresight. Every time Richard created a mess, I didn't just clean it up, I documented it. It started as a self-preservation instinct, a way to cover myself in case one of his schemes blew up so spectacularly that even I couldn't contain it. But over the years it evolved into something more. It became a chronicle, a private history of the company's true nature. In a fireproof safe in my home office, hidden behind a false wall panel, was a series of encrypted, password-protected external hard drives. This was my ledger. I called it the Shadow P&L. While the official profit and loss statements Richard presented to the board showed a glossy picture of success, my ledger told the real story. It was a monument to the cost of his recklessness. Each entry was organized with the cold precision of a coroner's report. There was an incident code, a date, and a brief factual description of the event. For example, IC07, Unauthorized Speculative Currency Trade, or AQ15, Vanguard Acquisition Due Diligence Failure. For each incident, I attached a series of files. First, Richard's initial directive, usually in the form of a saved email or a transcribed note from a meeting, complete with a timestamp. Second, my formal, written warnings against the action, along with the supporting data from my team. Third, a detailed breakdown of the fallout, the potential SEC fines we dodged, the lawsuits that were threatened, the reputational damage that required expensive PR campaigns to mitigate. But the masterstroke, the part that made the ledger so devastatingly effective, was the financial accounting. For every mess, I calculated two figures. The first was the quiet settlement cost. This was the real hard cash that bled out of the company to make these problems disappear. The undisclosed settlement paid to the plaintiff in a wrongful termination suit. The fees for the army of lawyers we kept on retainer. The consulting fee paid to a government official in a foreign country to make a regulatory problem go away. These were the millions that vanished from the balance sheet into vague line items like contingency expenses or professional services. The second figure was what I called the cost of chaos, the opportunity cost. I documented the promising low-risk projects we had to abandon because capital and manpower were diverted to putting out Richard's latest fire. The Shadow P&L wasn't just a list of scandals. It was a quantifiable multi-million-dollar analysis of how Richard's leadership was a direct parasitic drag on the company's value. It turned his boldness from a charismatic trait into a catastrophic financial liability. For 15 years, this ledger was my insurance policy. Now, it was my weapon. My first move was to secure my flank. I wasn't naive enough to think I could take on a man like Richard and a massive corporation without legal cover. The next morning, I didn't go to the office. I went to the downtown offices of a man named Marcus Thorne. No relation to Richard, a fact Marcus found endlessly amusing. Marcus was one of the sharpest, most ruthless corporate litigators in the city. The firm had used him on several occasions to handle our most sensitive disputes. He knew our playbook because he had helped write it. He was expensive, but as the old saying goes, you get what you pay for. I sat in his minimalist office, all glass and steel, and laid out the situation. I didn't give him the details of the ledger yet, just the broad strokes, the scapegoating of Lucas, the long history of malfeasance, and my intention to present this information to the new owners, Blackstone Equity Group. Marcus listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair. "He'll sue you into oblivion, Arthur," he said, "not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. Your NDA, your non-compete, your confidentiality agreements. He'll wallpaper this office with them. He'll claim you're a disgruntled employee trying to extort a bigger severance. He'll ruin you." "I'm aware," I said calmly. but you mentioned a loophole once, during the Cromwell case. You said a compliance officer's fiduciary duty to report material risk to ownership can, in certain circumstances, supersede a non-disclosure agreement, especially if there's evidence of actions that could harm the company, like say a cover-up that constitutes a violation of whistleblower protections. A slow smile spread across Marcus's face. He remembered, "You have a good memory, Arthur. It's a very small, very sharp needle to thread. You can't present this as a disgruntled employee. You can't even frame it as revenge. You have to present this as you, Arthur Hayes, head of compliance, performing your sworn duty to protect the firm from an existential threat. The threat in this case being its own CEO. You're not a whistleblower, you're a risk manager briefing the new board. It's a beautiful strategy, but you need proof. Irrefutable, undeniable proof." I slid a single encrypted flash drive across his desk. "This is an index of the full ledger. Consider it a table of contents. I'll need you on retainer, effective immediately." He picked up the drive, weighing it in his hand as if it were a precious gem. "This," he said, "is going to be fun." With my legal shield in place, I moved to my next target. I needed an insider, an ally who could corroborate my data from the inside. There was only one person I trusted, Sarah Jenkins, the vice president of finance. Sarah was cut from the same cloth as me. She'd been with the firm for over 20 years, a quiet, hyper-competent woman who understood that numbers don't lie. She had despised Richard's style for years but, like me, had stayed out of a sense of duty to the institution. She was David Chen's protégé, and she had never forgiven Richard for what he did to her mentor. I met her for coffee at a small out-of-the-way cafe far from the financial district. She looked tired. The strain of Project Omega was showing on her face. "He's spinning," she said before I even had a chance to speak. "He's telling the board it was a black swan event, unpredictable, a statistical anomaly. He's already drafting the narrative for the new owners. I'm going to give them a different narrative," I said. I explained my plan. I told her about the ledger, the shadow P and L. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not just surprise but validation. It was the look of someone who had known for years that something was wrong but could never quite put her finger on it. "All those years," she murmured, shaking her head. "The unexplained budget variances, the multi-million-dollar general expenses that Richard would personally sign off on, telling me they were for strategic development and not to worry about it. I always knew something was off. I just never had the full picture. I need you to help me complete it," I said. "I have the incidents and my estimated costs. You have the actual balance sheets. If you could, discreetly, match the dates of my ledger entries with those unexplained outflows, it would make the entire case airtight. It would cross-reference my claims with the company's own internal records." She didn't hesitate for a second. "Send me the dates," she said, her voice low and determined. "I'll get you the data. Richard has underestimated us for the last time. A spreadsheet can't measure character, but it can sure as hell measure the cost of having none." With Sarah on board, the final piece of my strategy fell into place. This wasn't going to be a messy, emotional confrontation. It would be a clinical, professional takedown. I wasn't going to be Arthur Hayes, the betrayed employee. I was going to be Arthur Hayes, the head of compliance, presenting a vital risk assessment briefing. My leverage wasn't just the scandals themselves, it was the narrative I would build around them, a narrative tailored for the unsentimental, data-driven world of private equity. They didn't care about feelings or loyalty. They cared about one thing: return on investment. I was about to show them, in excruciating detail, how Richard Thorne was the single worst investment they had ever made. I spent the next 2 days locked in my study, Marcus on a secure video line, Sarah sending me encrypted files. We worked with a feverish intensity, cross-referencing my ledger with her financial data. The picture that emerged was even worse than I had imagined. The quiet settlements and chaos costs added up to a staggering figure, north of $100 million over 15 years. Money that had simply vanished from the company's potential, bled away to cover the CEO's ego. I built the presentation. It was a masterpiece of corporate warfare. No emotional language, no accusations, just charts, graphs, and timelines. The core of it was a single devastating slide, reported EBITDA versus risk-adjusted EBITDA Thorn factor. The Thorn factor was the name I gave to the total financial drain documented in my ledger. The graph showed two lines. One was the steady, impressive growth the world saw. The other, my risk-adjusted line, was flatter, uglier, and showed a company that was chronically underperforming its potential. The final section of the presentation was titled Latent Personnel Liability. It was a case study of the firing of Lucas Vance. I framed it not as a moral outrage, but as a critical failure of the company's risk management protocols. I included Lucas's original Omega report, highlighting the sections where he had predicted the collapse with chilling accuracy. My final slide was a single sentence: the firm's current leadership has demonstrated a pattern of punishing accurate risk assessment and rewarding reckless behavior, creating a negative alpha talent environment. It was cold, corporate, and utterly damning. On Thursday morning, with the presentation loaded onto a new sterile laptop and a copy of the full ledger on a hard drive in my briefcase, I put on my best suit. I felt a strange calm settle over me. The fear and anger were gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of a man who knows he holds all the cards. I kissed Eleanor goodbye. She looked at me, her hand on my cheek. "Be careful, Arthur." "Careful was yesterday," I said. "Today is about being right." I walked out the door and drove towards the city, towards the gleaming glass tower of Blackstone Equity Group. I was no longer a janitor, I was an architect, and I was about to demolish the old building to reveal the solid foundation that had been there all along. The Blackstone Equity Group offices felt like they belonged to a different species. Where Sterling Thorn was all dark wood, brass, and a kind of self-important old money grandeur, this place was a study in minimalist power. White walls, concrete floors, glass partitions. It was less an office and more a laboratory for making money. There was no art on the walls, just large screens displaying market data in crisp, silent fonts. It was a place that had no time for sentiment. It was perfect. I was shown into a conference room that overlooked the entire southern tip of Manhattan. The view was breathtaking, a god's-eye perspective of the world of finance. A woman was already there, standing by the window, much like Richard had, but her posture was different. It wasn't a pose of ownership, it was one of analysis. She turned as I entered. She was perhaps in her late 40s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of absolute, unshakable composure. "Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. She didn't offer to shake my hand. "I'm Evelyn Reed. I lead the post-acquisition integration team. Your email was intriguing. You said you had material information regarding latent risk liabilities. That's a bold claim to make about a firm we just spent 6 months doing due diligence on. You have 30 minutes. I didn't waste any of it on pleasantries. I just nodded, opened my laptop, and connected it to the massive screen that dominated one wall. "Thank you for your time, Miss Reed. I am here in my capacity as head of compliance for Sterling Thorn. My sole purpose is to ensure the new ownership is fully apprised of certain off-balance sheet risks that did not and could not appear in a standard due diligence process." My first slide appeared on the screen. It was the devastating graph, reported P&L versus actualized risk-adjusted P&L. I saw a flicker of interest in her eyes. I had her attention. "For the past 15 years, I began, my voice even and measured, Sterling Thorn has operated under 2 sets of books. One is the official accounting you've seen. The other is what I call the shadow P&L, a ledger I have personally maintained to track the financial impact of unscheduled high-risk executive actions." I walked her through 3 case studies, my greatest hits of cleanup. I started with the insider trading scare, framing it not as a crime but as an unauthorized deployment of firm capital in a high-risk regulation-sensitive trade. I showed her the dates, and then, thanks to Sarah's data, I showed her the corresponding $2.5 million strategic consulting fee that was paid to a shell corporation 2 weeks after the SEC closed its inquiry. This, I said, pointing to the line item, was the cost of making that problem disappear. Next, I moved to the Vanguard acquisition. I presented the original negative analysis from David Chen and my team, side by side with Richard's glowing presentation to the board. Then I laid out the timeline of the near collapse and the emergency measures I had to take. I quantified the cost, not just the direct losses from the toxic assets, but the $45 million in high-interest bridge financing we had to secure, and the 3 promising fintech startups we had to pass on acquiring because our capital was frozen. The official narrative calls this a successful navigation of market headwinds, I said. The data shows it was a self-inflicted wound that cost this firm an estimated $70 million in long-term value. Evelyn Reed was silent, her eyes darting between me and the screen. She wasn't taking notes. She was absorbing everything, her mind working like a high-speed processor. For my final act, I brought up Project Omega. I put Lucas Vance's report on the screen, his dire warnings highlighted in red. Then I put up the email from Richard's office, dismissing the report and ordering the project to proceed. And finally, I showed her the termination letter, citing Lucas's insufficient analysis as the cause for his dismissal. I turned from the screen to face her directly. Miss Reed, this is the most significant latent liability at Sterling Thorne. We have a leadership culture that actively punishes correct, data-driven risk assessment and scapegoats the very individuals who try to protect the firm's assets. You haven't just acquired a company, you've acquired a 15-year pattern of behavior that directly and quantifiably destroys shareholder value. The biggest risk to your investment isn't market volatility, it's the man in the corner office. His charisma is the most expensive non-performing asset on the books. I finished. I had used 28 of my 30 minutes. I slid the hard drive containing the complete ledger across the table. This contains all the supporting documentation for my analysis. All of it is sourced from Sterling Thorne's own servers and financial records. I trust you will treat it with the appropriate discretion. Evelyn Reed finally spoke. Her voice was as calm as it had been when I walked in, but her eyes had a new steely glint. "Mr. Hayes," she said, picking up the hard drive. "We will be in touch." That was it. I was dismissed. I packed up my laptop and walked out of that room, leaving the bomb on the table behind me. The next few days were a masterclass in corporate silence. I went to the office and did my job. Richard was in a triumphant mood, basking in the glow of the acquisition and the swift, decisive handling of the Omega failure. He saw me in the hallway on Friday and clapped me on the shoulder. "Good work on the Omega cleanup, Arthur. Glad we have that behind us. Loyalty. That's what makes this place great." He smiled his $1,000,000 smile. It had no effect on me anymore. I just nodded and kept walking. The panic started the following Monday. It came in a text from Sarah. "He can't get them on the phone." Apparently, Richard had tried to schedule a welcome dinner for Evelyn Reed and her team. They had declined through an assistant, citing a need to deepen their post-acquisition analysis. Richard then tried to call Evelyn directly. The call went to her voicemail. He tried her deputy. Voicemail. He was used to being the center of gravity, the man everyone wanted to talk to. The sudden silence from his new owners was something he couldn't comprehend. By Tuesday, the first tremors were felt inside the firm. A team from Blackstone, a grim-faced group of auditors and analysts I secretly called the executioners, arrived unannounced. They didn't go to the executive floor. They set up shop in a vacant conference room on the finance floor and began summoning people for interviews, starting with Sarah. Richard, I learned from Sarah's frantic texts, was completely blindsided. He tried to welcome the audit team, to charm them. They looked right through him, their faces impassive masks. "He's losing it," Sarah texted me late that afternoon, pacing in his office, yelling at his assistant. "He keeps asking what I talked to them about. I just said we were reviewing standard Q3 financials. He's sweating through his shirts. He thinks this is about the Omega losses. He has no idea what's really coming." Richard's arrogance was his Achilles heel. He couldn't imagine a threat that wasn't directly about a recent public failure. The idea that his entire history, his very character, was being audited, was beyond his comprehension. He thought it was about a number on a spreadsheet, a problem that could be managed with a clever narrative. He still didn't understand that I hadn't given them a number. I had given them a pattern, and for people like Evelyn Reed, a pattern of risk is infinitely more dangerous than a one-time loss. The silent takeover was underway. The first visible crack in the dam appeared on Wednesday. Mark Chen, our head of R&D and a 25-year veteran of the firm, walked into my office and closed the door. Mark was a brilliant but quiet engineer, a man who had seen a dozen of his innovative long-term projects shelved to fund Richard's latest gambles. He was a good man who was tired of fighting a losing battle. "I got a call from Blackstone this morning, Arthur," he said, his face grim. "They asked me very specific questions about Project Archimedes." Project Archimedes had been Mark's brainchild 5 years ago, a revolutionary trading platform that would have put us a decade ahead of our competitors. It was fully funded and in its final stages of development when Richard had suddenly pulled the plug, redirecting the entire budget to finance the disastrous Vanguard acquisition. The opportunity cost I had detailed in my ledger. They wanted to know why it was canceled. Mark continued. They had the exact date. They had the budget numbers. I told them the truth. I told them we were ordered to kill it to fund an acquisition that the entire R&D and finance division had advised against. He paused, taking a deep breath. This afternoon I tendered my resignation, not to Richard. I sent it directly to Evelyn Reed. I cited a fundamental lack of confidence in the strategic direction of the current executive leadership. This was it, the talent exodus. It was the signal I had been waiting for. Richard's power wasn't just his title, it was the perception that he was the firm, that all the talent, all the success flowed from him. Mark's resignation sent directly to the new owners shattered that illusion. It reframed the narrative. The talent wasn't with Richard. The talent was in spite of Richard. It was a vote of no confidence from the very heart of the company's future. News of Mark's resignation spread through the senior ranks like wildfire. The atmosphere in the office, according to Sarah's updates, became ghostly. People were keeping their heads down, their doors closed. The usual boisterous energy of the trading floor was replaced by a tense, watchful silence. Loyalty is a funny thing in a corporate environment. It's often just a form of momentum. Once that momentum is broken, once people see a viable alternative to the status quo, their allegiance can shift with breathtaking speed. The old guard, the competent but sidelined managers who had endured Richard's reign for years, were now watching, waiting. They smelled blood in the water. It took Richard until Thursday afternoon to finally understand the true nature of the game. I don't know who told him, or if he finally put the pieces together himself, but my phone rang, and it was his private cell number. The caller ID glowed on my screen like a warning light. I let it ring twice, then answered, my voice a mask of calm professionalism. "Arthur Hayes, what did you do?" he snarled. The charm was gone. The carefully cultivated mask of the statesman had been ripped away, revealing the panicked, entitled bully beneath. There was no greeting, just a raw, accusatory bark. "I'm not sure what you mean, Richard," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level. "Don't play dumb with me, Arthur," he shouted. I could hear the tremor in his voice. It was fear, pure, unadulterated fear. Blackstone, the auditors, Mark Chen's resignation. This all started with you. They're crawling all over my past deals. Your name is on the visitor log at their building. My assistant saw it. What did you tell them? I let the silence hang for a moment, letting him stew in his own panic. I did my job, Richard. I said finally, I provided the new ownership with a comprehensive risk analysis, as is my duty as head of compliance. There was a choked, incredulous sound on the other end of the line. He was processing it. He still couldn't believe his janitor, his loyal fixer, had turned on him. Then his tone shifted. The anger evaporated, replaced by the desperate, oily charm he always reverted to when cornered. "Arthur, listen to me. We can fix this. You and me. We've always fixed it. There's been a misunderstanding. Whatever they're offering you, I'll double it. We'll make you a partner, a full partner. We'll put you on the board. You want to be COO. The job is yours. We'll rehire the kid, Lucas. We'll say there was an error in the review. We'll make it right. It was pathetic. He was trying to buy the one thing he had just proven was worthless in his world, my loyalty. He was offering me the very promotions he had denied me for years, offering to undo the very injustice that had triggered this whole affair, as if it were all just a negotiation. He still didn't get it. This was never about me. It's too late for that, Richard, I said, and my voice was as cold and hard as the glass on his new owner's windows. This isn't about a bigger package or a new title. It's about fiduciary duty. My loyalty is to the firm, and the firm now belongs to Blackstone. There's nothing to fix. I'm simply doing my job. For the first time in a very long time, I am doing my real job. I hung up the phone. The power shift was complete. He was no longer the king. He was just a liability on a balance sheet, and his account was about to be closed. The end came on a Friday, exactly 1 week after Lucas had been fired. It was swift, silent, and brutally corporate. An email went out at 9 a.m. from Evelyn Reed's office, announcing a mandatory, all-hands board meeting in 1 hour. The location was the main conference room, the same room where Lucas's career had been sacrificed just days before. The symmetry was not lost on me. I walked in and took a seat at the far end of the table. Richard was already there, looking haggard. His suit seemed too big for him, his usual tan replaced by a pasty gray pallor. He tried to catch my eye, to give me a look that was part threat, part plea. I ignored him, keeping my gaze fixed on the blank screen at the front of the room. The other board members, the ones who had enabled Richard for years, filed in, their faces a mixture of confusion and anxiety. They were Richard's men, but their survival instincts were kicking in. They looked like a flock of birds sensing an approaching hawk. Evelyn Reed entered last, followed by 2 stern-looking men I didn't recognize. They had the unmistakable look of corporate security. She didn't sit down. She stood at the head of the table, the picture of calm authority. She didn't have a presentation or any notes. She didn't need them. "Good morning," she said, her voice cutting through the tense silence. "Thank you for joining on such short notice. As the new stewards of this firm, Blackstone's primary responsibility is to maximize shareholder value and mitigate risk. Over the past week, our post-acquisition audit has uncovered a pattern of systemic undocumented financial liabilities and a culture of risk management that is incompatible with our governance standards." She paused, her cold eyes sweeping across the faces at the table before finally landing on Richard. "As a result, we are making a change in executive leadership, effective immediately. Richard, your employment with Sterling Thorne is terminated." It was so simple, so direct. There was no room for argument. Richard's jaw dropped. He looked around the table at his allies, his board members, but they wouldn't meet his gaze. They were staring down at their notepads, at their hands, anywhere but at him. His kingdom had dissolved in an instant. "You can't do this," he sputtered, his voice a pathetic squeak. "I built this firm." Evelyn didn't even blink. "You will receive a standard severance package as stipulated in your contract, contingent on your full cooperation and adherence to your non-disclosure agreement." One of the security men took a step forward. "Mr. Thorne will escort you to your office to collect your personal belongings." Richard stood up, his face a mask of disbelief and fury. He looked at me then, a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. He had finally realized that the janitor had not just refused to clean up the mess, he had turned on the lights for everyone to see it. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came out. Defeated, he turned and let the security detail lead him from the room, a king being quietly escorted to the guillotine. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 3 minutes. The vindication wasn't loud or explosive. It was silent, professional, and absolute. After the old board members had been dismissed, their own futures now very much in doubt, Evelyn turned to me. "Mr. Hayes," she said, We would like you to serve as interim CEO while we conduct a search for a permanent replacement. Your first task will be to stabilize the firm and restore confidence." I nodded. "I accept." I walked out of that conference room and went not to the corner office but to my own. I sat down at my desk and made my first official call as interim CEO. It was to Lucas. He answered on the second ring, his voice wary. "Hello? Lucas, it's Arthur Hayes." There was a pause. "Oh, hi Arthur. I'm calling to offer you a job," I said. "I'd like you to come back to Sterling Thorne, not as an analyst. I'm creating a new position, director of the new Risk and Governance Oversight Committee. You'll report directly to the CEO and the board. Your job will be to ensure that the kind of failure that happened with Project Omega can never happen again. Your job will be to tell the truth, no matter who it upsets." There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear him breathing. "Is this a joke?" he finally asked, his voice thick with emotion. "No, Lucas," I said. "It's not a joke. I told you I would prove that integrity wasn't a lie around here. This is me keeping that promise." He accepted. Sarah Jenkins was promoted to permanent chief financial officer an hour later. The competent old guard, the quiet professionals who had been sidelined for years, were now in charge. The entire atmosphere of the firm began to shift. The frantic, charismatic energy of Richard's reign replaced by a calm, focused sense of purpose. We were no longer a cult of personality. We were a business again. That afternoon I sent a company-wide memo. It was short and to the point. It ended with a simple line, a mantra for our new reality. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. We are done losing it. A few months have passed. I'm not the CEO anymore. I never wanted the job. We hired a brilliant woman from the outside to take the permanent role, someone with a track record of stability and ethical leadership. I'm back in my old office, with my old title, Head of Compliance. But everything is different. My role is no longer about cleaning up messes. It's about preventing them. I report directly to the board and the new CEO. My recommendations are not just heard, they are implemented. My team, with Lucas at the helm of his new committee, is the most respected department in the firm. We are the foundation now, not the janitors. I look out my window. The city is the same, the view is the same, but the company I see reflected in the glass is fundamentally changed. It's stable. It's growing, but it's growing intelligently. It's honest. Sarah and I have lunch every week. Not in some secret cafe, but in the executive dining room. We talk about numbers, about strategy, about building something that will last, something real. I sometimes think about Richard. I heard he's tied up in personal lawsuits from investors in some of his side ventures that went belly up without the firm's capital to prop them up. His charisma, it turns out, had a price, and he's finally paying it himself. I don't feel joy at his downfall. I just feel a sense of balance. The universe, in its own slow corporate way, righted itself. My ledger is back in its safe, the hard drives wiped clean and put away. Its purpose is served. It was a monument to a lie, and the truth has now been made manifest. My real legacy isn't that secret file. It's Lucas Vance, sitting in his new office down the hall, mentoring a new generation of young analysts, teaching them what I should have been teaching all along. That loyalty isn't about protecting a person. It's about protecting the principles the person is supposed to represent. For 15 years, I thought my job was to be the silent, loyal soldier. I thought that swallowing the truth and cleaning up the mess was a form of strength, a necessary sacrifice for the good of the whole. I was wrong. Silence in the face of corruption isn't loyalty, it's complicity. True loyalty is holding power accountable, even when it's frightening, even when it costs you something. Many of you watching this know a Richard Thorne. You've worked in a place where a charming narrative is valued more than a hard fact, where loyalty is a one-way street that only leads to you getting run over. You may feel trapped, just like I did, by golden handcuffs or a misguided sense of duty. My story is proof that the most powerful asset you have is your own competence, your own integrity. It might feel like a liability in a broken system, but when the time is right, it's the only weapon that truly matters. A spreadsheet can't measure character, but eventually, the bill for a lack of it always comes due. Never let anyone convince you that your principles are a cost center. They are your ultimate, non-negotiable asset. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or been asked to sacrifice your integrity for someone else's gain, let me know about it in the comments below. I promise you, I read them all. Share this video with someone who needs to be reminded that competence always wins in the end. And please, don't forget to like this video and hit that subscribe button for more stories about the quiet battles that truly define our professional lives. Thank you for listening.